Mark Turner's phone screen glowed in the darkness of his bedroom at 11:43 p.m., and his thumb hovered over the send button for just a second before he tapped it. The message was simple, the same one he sent every night when Emma stayed at his mother's house. I love you, sleep tight, sweet dreams, princess. He set the phone down on the nightstand, rubbed his eyes, and let out a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire week with it. Friday nights used to mean something different. They used to mean Sarah curled up beside him, her head on his chest, both of them too tired to watch whatever movie they'd queued up. They used to mean laughter from down the hall as Emma refused to stay in bed, sneaking out for one more glass of water, one more hug, one more story. Now, Friday nights meant silence. Just him, the blue light of his phone, and the hollow ache of a house that felt too big for two people, let alone one. His phone buzzed. He almost didn't look, assuming it was his mother confirming Emma was asleep, but something made him reach for it anyway. The notification made his stomach drop so fast he actually sat up in bed. Rachel Chen, that's very sweet, Mark, but I think you meant this for someone else. His blood went cold. No, 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 no. He grabbed the phone with both hands, fingers suddenly clumsy, and scrolled up to his sent messages. There it was, sent not to Emma, but to Rachel, because apparently his exhausted brain had clicked the wrong name in his recently messaged contacts. The woman who signed his performance reviews. The woman who led Monday morning meetings with calm authority and made decisions that affected 20 people's careers. His boss. He just sent his boss a message that said, I love you. Mark's hands were shaking as he typed. Oh God, Rachel, I'm so sorry. That was meant for my daughter. She's staying at my mom's tonight, and I always text her goodnight. I'm so sorry. This is so embarrassing. He hit send and immediately wanted to throw the phone across the room. Could he unsend a text message? Could he quit his job via email at midnight? Could he move to another city and start over? His phone buzzed again. It's okay, these things happen, no harm done. See you Monday. Her response was professional, kind even, but Mark could read between every word. She was being polite. She was probably sitting in her apartment right now wondering if her project manager had completely lost his mind, or if this was some kind of inappropriate advance disguised as an accident. He wanted to explain further, to somehow make this less mortifying. But every draft message he typed sounded worse than the last. He set the phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling, the same ceiling he'd stared at for 2 years now, since the night the hospital called to tell him Sarah hadn't made it through surgery. A routine procedure, they'd said. Low risk, they'd said. But something had gone wrong with the anesthesia, and she'd never woken up. Emma had been 4 years old. Now she was 6. And sometimes Mark caught her staring at the framed photos in the hallway with an expression that made his chest hurt. Like she was trying to remember a face that was already fading. He was doing his best. He got her to school on time most mornings, packed lunches that were probably too heavy on the prepackaged snacks, but contained all the major food groups. He helped with homework at the kitchen table, read bedtime stories in different voices, braided her hair even though the braids were never quite even. But he was so tired, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. Work had become his second shift. Mark had been promoted to project manager 8 months ago, right around the time Rachel Chen transferred from the Seattle office to lead their department. She was younger than he'd expected from her reputation, only 32, with sharp eyes that didn't miss details and a way of running meetings that made everyone feel heard without letting discussions spiral into chaos. She was professional to her core, kept appropriate distance, never joined the team for happy hours or casual lunches. But there had been moments, small moments that Mark had probably read too much into because he was lonely and she was kind. Like the afternoon she'd noticed him staring blankly at his computer screen and quietly moved his deadline back 3 days without making him ask, or the morning he'd shown up with Emma in tow because his mother had been sick and the school called about a burst pipe. And instead of being irritated, Rachel had set up Emma at the conference room table with printer paper and markers, checking on her every 30 minutes with a gentle smile that Mitzi add something in Mark's chest twist. That company family day 3 months ago had been the worst, or maybe the best. He still wasn't sure. It was a Saturday picnic thing, supposedly optional, but everyone knew it looked bad not to show up. Mark had brought Emma, who'd been shy at first, clinging to his leg while other kids ran wild near the bounce house. Rachel had been standing near the beverage table, and when she saw them, she'd walked over and crouched down to Emma's level. "What's your name?" she'd asked, her voice softer than Mark had ever heard it in the office. Emma had whispered her name, and Rachel had smiled. "That's a beautiful name. I like your butterfly shirt. Did you know butterflies can taste with their feet? Emma's eyes had gone wide, and just like that, Rachel had pulled her into a conversation about insects and flowers and whether purple or pink was the superior color. Mark had watched his daughter laugh for the first time in weeks, really laugh. And when Rachel stood up and met his eyes, something passed between them that he'd been trying not to think about ever since. He'd been attracted to her before that, in an abstract way he felt guilty about. But seeing her with Emma, seeing how natural and warm she became when she dropped the professional armor, that had been different. That had been dangerous. Because Mark wasn't looking for complicated. He wasn't looking for anything, really, except maybe a way to get through each day without feeling like he was drowning. And Rachel Chen was his boss. She was brilliant and focused and probably had a life full of things that didn't include broken widowers with kids and houses that smelled like macaroni and cheese 3 nights a week. So he'd buried it, kept his interactions professional, thanked her politely when she was kind, and absolutely never let himself imagine what it might be like if she looked at him the way she'd looked at Emma that day. Like he was someone worth knowing. And now he'd sent her a love letter. Well, not a love letter, but she didn't know that, not really. She had to be sitting in her apartment thinking this was some kind of crush-addled mess she'd have to navigate carefully on Monday morning. Maybe she was already drafting an HR conversation in her head. Mark, I value you as an employee, but I think we need to establish some boundaries. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Monday was going to be a nightmare. He'd have to face her in the morning meeting, pretend everything was normal, endure whatever awkward dance they'd have to do around this, until enough time passed that they could both pretend it never happened. Sleep wasn't coming. Mark grabbed his phone again, scrolled through photos of Emma to calm himself down. Her first day of kindergarten, her birthday party at the park, her asleep on the couch with chocolate ice cream still on her chin. His chest ached. She was everything. The only thing that made sense anymore. Every decision he made was for her. Every late night at work was to keep the job that paid for her dance classes and her college fund, and the childhood he desperately wanted to be normal, even though it wasn't, even though it would never be what it was supposed to be. Sarah should have been here. She should have been the one braiding Emma's hair and teaching her about butterflies and tucking her in at night. Mark was just the understudy, doing his best with a script he'd never wanted to perform alone. His phone was silent now. Rachel had said her piece and signed off, probably relieved the conversation was over. Mark set an alarm for 7 a.m., even though it was almost 1 in the morning now, because Emma would be home by 9 and he needed to clean the kitchen and finish the laundry, and maybe if he kept himself busy enough tomorrow, he could stop replaying this disaster in his head. He turned off the bedside lamp and lay there in the dark, listening to the house settle around him. The heater kicked on. The neighbor's dog barked once, then went quiet. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Normal sounds. Life continuing like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. That Monday morning would bring a conversation that would make everything worse. That he'd ruined the one working relationship that had made his job bearable. Rachel would be polite about it, because she was professional above all else. But there would be distance now. Careful distance. The kind of distance that made it clear he'd made her uncomfortable, and she was handling it gracefully. But he needed to never, ever do anything like that again. He must have dozed off eventually because he woke to his phone buzzing on the nightstand. The room was still dark. The clock said 1047 a.m. Mark grabbed the phone, blinking against the screen brightness, expecting his mother. Expecting some middle-of-the-night emergency with Emma, but it wasn't his mother. It was his doorbell camera, motion-activated, showing a figure standing on his front porch. His heart rate spiked. Who the hell was at his door at almost 2 in the morning? He pulled up the live feed, squinting at the image, and his breath caught in his throat. It was Rachel. She was standing there in the cold December rain, wearing the same gray blazer and black pants she'd probably worn to the office that day, her hair damp and plastered to her cheeks. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking down, arms wrapped around herself. And even through the grainy video feed, Mark could see she was shivering. This didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Had something happened? Was there some kind of emergency at work? But why would she drive to his house instead of calling? Why would she be standing in the rain like she'd been there for a while, working up the courage to ring the bell? Mark was out of bed before he'd fully processed what he was doing, pulling on the sweatpants he'd left on the floor, grabbing a t-shirt from the dresser. His hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his mind racing through possibilities. Maybe someone had broken into the office. Maybe there was a crisis with the Seattle project. Maybe she'd been in an accident and needed help, and his house was closer than she'd realized. None of those explanations fit what he'd seen on the camera, the way she'd been standing there so still, so uncertain, but he couldn't think of what else would bring her here. He unlocked the front door and pulled it open. The cold air hit him first, and then he saw her clearly, standing 3 feet away on his porch, and she looked nothing like the composed executive who ran morning meetings. She looked lost, vulnerable. Her mascara was smudged slightly at the corners of her eyes, like maybe she'd been crying, or maybe it was just the rain. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Mark realized he had no idea what to say. "Rachel, are you okay?" seemed both obvious and completely inadequate. "What are you doing here?" sounded accusatory. "Is something wrong?" Assumed too much. Rachel spoke first, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "Can I come in?" It wasn't a demand. It was a question, tentative, like she wasn't sure he'd say yes. Mark stepped back immediately, holding the door wider. "Of course. Yes. Come in, you're soaking wet." She walked past him into the entryway, and he caught the scent of rain and something floral, her perfume maybe, and then he was closing the door and they were standing in his living room, and the silence was so thick he could hear water dripping from her blazer onto the hardwood floor. He should offer her a towel. He should ask if she wanted tea or coffee or something to warm her up. He should do any of the normal things a person does when someone shows up at their door in the middle of the night, but he couldn't move. He could only stand there, staring at her, trying to understand what was happening. Rachel turned to face him fully, and the expression on her face was one he'd never seen before. It wasn't professional distance. It wasn't the warm but careful kindness she'd shown Emma. It was something raw, something uncertain, something that looked almost like fear. "Mark," she said, and then stopped. She took a breath, wrapped her arms tighter around herself even though she was inside now, out of the rain. "I couldn't stop thinking about your text." And the way she said it, the weight in those words, made Mark's heart start pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. This wasn't about work. This wasn't about an emergency. This was about the message he'd sent, the accident that wasn't supposed to mean anything. And suddenly he didn't know if he should apologize again or stay silent or ask the question that was screaming in his head. "Why are you here, Rachel?" His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her trying to decide something, weighing words she hadn't said yet. Then she took a step closer, close enough that he could see the way her hands were trembling slightly. And she said something that made the entire world shift beneath his feet. "Because I needed to know if you meant it. Not for your daughter, for me." The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible. Mark felt his breath catch, felt the room tilt slightly, felt every assumption he'd made about this night shatter and rearrange itself into something he didn't have a map for. Rachel was still standing there, soaking wet, trembling, waiting for an answer to a question he'd never imagined she would ask. "Because I needed to know if you meant it. Not for your daughter. For me." His mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. His brain was trying to catch up, trying to process the fact that his boss had driven to his house at nearly 2 in the morning to ask if he'd accidentally confessed feelings he'd been burying for months. "I don't understand," he finally managed, and it came out helpless, confused. "Rachel, that text was an accident. I told you that. It was meant for Emma." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected him to say that, but her eyes didn't leave his face. "I know what you told me. I know what you meant to send. But Mark, I've been standing outside for 20 minutes trying to decide if I should ring your doorbell or just drive home and pretend I never came here. And the reason I couldn't decide is because part of me hoped the accident was just you being careless with who you were texting, and part of me hoped it wasn't an accident at all." Mark felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd been keeping sealed tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He took a step back, ran his hand through his hair, tried to find solid ground in a conversation that felt like it was happening in a dream. "You're my boss," he said, and it sounded weak even to his own ears. Rachel let out a breath that might have been a laugh, or might have been something sadder. "I know. Believe me, I know. That's why I've been fighting this for months. That's why I've kept every interaction professional. Why I don't come to happy hours. Why I've been so careful not to show you that. Every time you talk about Emma, my heart breaks a little, because I can see how much you love her, and how hard you're trying, and how lonely you are." The last word hit him like a physical thing. Lonely. Was it that obvious? Had everyone seen it? Or just her? Mark's throat felt tight. He wanted to deny it, to maintain some shred of dignity, but what was the point? She was standing in his living room at 2 in the morning, having driven through the rain to ask him about a text message. This was not a moment for pretending. Yeah, he said quietly. I'm lonely. I've been lonely since Sarah died, and some days it feels like I'm drowning in it. But I can't afford to fall apart, because Emma needs me and work needs me. And I don't have the luxury of being a mess. So I get up every morning, and I pack lunches, and I make spreadsheets, and I do everything I'm supposed to do. And I'm so tired, Rachel. I'm so tired I can barely see straight most days. He hadn't meant to say all of that, hadn't meant to let the dam break. But once he started, he couldn't stop, and Rachel was looking at him with such understanding, such recognition, that it made his eyes burn. And yes, he continued, his voice rough now, if you want the truth, I've had feelings for you that I had no business having. Since that family day when you talked to Emma about butterflies, and you smiled at her like she mattered, like she was more than just some employee's kid you had to tolerate, I watched you with her and I thought, God, this is what it would look like if Emma had someone besides me. If I had someone besides Emma. And I hated myself for thinking it. Because you're my boss, and I'm not supposed to feel anything except professional respect. And also because Sarah's only been gone 2 years, and what kind of person develops feelings for someone when they're supposed to still be grieving? Rachel's expression shifted, something painful crossing her face. You're allowed to grieve and still be human, Mark. You're allowed to be lonely and want connection. You're allowed to look at someone and feel something without it being a betrayal. He shook his head. How would you know? The question came out sharper than he intended, defensive, and he immediately regretted it. But Rachel didn't flinch. She just stood there, water still dripping from her blazer, and said quietly, because I lost someone too. The room went still. Mark stared at her, and she met his gaze steadily, her chin lifting slightly like she was bracing herself. His name was Daniel. We were engaged. He died 4 years ago, sudden cardiac arrest at 31 while he was out on a morning run. No warning, no goodbye, just a phone call from the hospital telling me to come quickly, and then another call. An hour later telling me not to bother because he was already gone. She paused, her voice wavering slightly. I threw myself into work after that, transferred cities, took on more responsibility, kept everything professional and distant because if I didn't let anyone close, then I couldn't lose anyone else. And it worked, mostly. Until I met you. Mark felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. Rachel continued, her words coming faster now, like she needed to get them out before she lost her nerve. That family day, when I saw you with Emma, when I saw how gentle you were with her, and how patient and how much love was just radiating from you, even though I could also see the exhaustion and the grief, something in me cracked. I went home that night and I cried for the first time in 2 years, because I realized I'd been so focused on protecting myself that I'd forgotten what it felt like to want something, to want someone. And that terrified me. She took a step closer to him, and Mark's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. I've been texting my therapist about you for weeks, she admitted, and there was something almost like embarrassment in her voice. Trying to figure out if what I was feeling was real or if I was just projecting, if maybe I was seeing in you what I'd lost in Daniel. She helped me understand that sometimes feelings don't make sense. Sometimes they're inconvenient and complicated, and they show up at exactly the wrong time with exactly the wrong person. And sometimes they're real anyway. Mark couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Rachel was talking about feelings, about him, about them. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But she was still talking, her voice softer now. When I got your text tonight, my first instinct was to be professional about it, to brush it off, make it easy for you, pretend it didn't affect me. But then I kept staring at those words, I love you. And I kept thinking, what if he did mean them? What if somewhere in his subconscious he was feeling the same impossible thing I've been feeling? What if I let this moment pass, and I spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to ask? If you're feeling this story, if it's touching something in you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Because stories like this, stories about real people finding connection in the messiest, most unexpected ways, these are the ones that matter. These are the ones that remind us we're not alone in our loneliness, in our longing, in our fear of trying again. Mark's voice came out as barely a whisper. So you drove here at 2 in the morning in the rain to ask me if I meant a text message I sent by accident. Rachel nodded. I did, because I needed to know. I needed to hear you say it out loud, one way or another, so I could stop wondering. So we could both stop pretending. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the executive who signed his paychecks and ran efficient meetings. He saw a woman who was just as scared as he was, just as lonely, just as tired of being strong all the time. I did mean it, he said finally. Not the text itself. That really was meant for Emma. But the feeling behind it. I've been falling for you for months, and I've hated myself for it, and tried to stop it and failed completely. And I have no idea what we do with that information, because you're right, this is complicated and messy, and probably a terrible idea for about 17 different reasons. Rachel's eyes were shining now, bright with unshed tears. I know all those reasons. I've listed them to my therapist every week. The power dynamic, the professional ethics, the fact that we're both still healing from losses that probably haven't healed as much as we pretend they have, the fact that you have a daughter who has to come first, and I don't know if I'm ready to be any kind of parental figure to anyone. All of it. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. But here's what I also know. I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of protecting myself from every possible hurt. I drove here tonight because I realized that some mistakes aren't mistakes at all. Sometimes they're just life giving you permission to be honest. Mark felt something break loose in him, something that had been locked down tight for 2 years. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest, her wet blazer soaking through his t-shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, and Mark couldn't remember the last time he'd felt another adult's heartbeat against his. Couldn't remember the last time someone had held him like he was worth holding. Rachel's shoulders shook slightly, and he realized she was crying, quiet tears that she was trying to muffle against his shirt. I don't know how to do this, he said into her hair. I don't know how to date someone I work with, or how to introduce you to Emma, or how to navigate any of this without screwing it up. She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her face blotchy and beautiful, and so vulnerable it made his chest ache. I don't know either, but maybe we don't have to have all the answers tonight. Maybe we just have to be honest about what we feel and figure out the rest as we go. They moved to the couch without discussing it, Mark grabbing a blanket from the basket by the fireplace and wrapping it around Rachel's shoulders. She kicked off her wet shoes and curled into the corner of the couch, and he sat beside her, close enough that their knees touched. The rain was still falling outside, a steady rhythm against the windows, and the house felt different somehow. Less empty. Less haunted by everything he'd lost. Tell me about Sarah, Rachel said softly. Mark tensed instinctively, the old defensive reflex kicking in. But then he looked at her face, open and patient, and realized she wasn't asking out of morbid curiosity. She was asking because she understood, because she'd lost someone too, because she knew that the dead don't disappear just because you develop feelings for someone new. So he told her about how Sarah had been his high school sweetheart, how they'd gotten married too young, probably, but it had worked anyway. About her laugh and her terrible cooking and the way she sang off key in the shower. About the pregnancy with Emma and the sleepless nights and the way they'd figured out parenting together through exhaustion and love and a lot of trial and error. About the routine surgery that wasn't supposed to be dangerous. The phone call that shattered everything. The 2 years since that had been a blur of grief and single parenting and trying to hold pieces together that didn't quite fit anymore. Rachel listened without interrupting, her hand finding his at some point, their fingers intertwining. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She sounds like she was wonderful." Mark nodded. She was. And I loved her. I still love her, in the way you love someone who shaped who you are. But she's gone, and I'm still here, and I don't think she'd want me to spend the rest of my life alone because I feel guilty about moving forward. Rachel squeezed his hand. "Tell me about Daniel," he said. And she did. About the man who'd been brilliant and funny and drove her crazy with his refusal to plan anything more than a day in advance. About the engagement ring she still had in a box in her closet because she couldn't bring herself to do anything with it. About the anger she'd felt at the unfairness of it all. The way she'd pushed everyone away in the aftermath. The career ambition that had become both her salvation and her prison. About the loneliness that looked different from Mark's, but felt just as heavy. They talked until the rain stopped and the first hints of dawn started lightening the sky. They talked about Emma and whether Rachel was ready to meet her properly, not as Mark's boss, but as someone who might become part of their lives. They talked about work and how they'd navigate the professional complications, maybe eventually transferring one of them to a different department if things got serious. They talked about therapy and grief and the fact that healing wasn't linear, that there would be hard days ahead even if they decided to try this. "What are we deciding?" Mark asked as the living room filled with gray morning light. Rachel looked at him, and there was still fear in her eyes, but something else too, something that looked like hope. "I think we're deciding to be honest, to see where this goes, to take it slow because we both have a lot to lose and a lot to protect, but also to stop pretending we don't feel what we feel." Mark nodded slowly. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, his mother texting that Emma was awake and asking when he'd pick her up. Reality was reasserting itself. The practical concerns of a Saturday morning with a 6-year-old who needed breakfast and attention. Rachel saw him check the message and smiled softly. "You should go get your daughter." Mark looked at her. This woman who'd driven through the rain at 2 in the morning to ask him about a text message, who cried in his arms and told him her secrets and somehow made him feel less alone than he'd felt in 2 years. "When can I see you again?" he asked. "Not at work. Here, like this." Rachel stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and Mark stood too. She reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. "Tomorrow, if you want, bring Emma to the park near the lake, the one with the good swings. I'll accidentally run into you. We'll see how it feels, the three of us together. No pressure, just ice cream and playground equipment and seeing if this could actually work in daylight." Mark walked her to the door, and before she left, she turned and looked at him one more time. "Thank you for being honest," she said. "Thank you for not making me feel crazy for showing up here." He shook his head. "You're not crazy. You're brave. There's a difference." She smiled, really smiled, and it transformed her face into something radiant. Then she was gone, walking to her car in the early morning light, and Mark stood in the doorway watching until she drove away. 3 weeks later, on Christmas morning, Mark woke up to Emma jumping on his bed, shrieking about presents under the tree. He got up, made coffee, watched his daughter tear into wrapping paper with the pure joy only a 6-year-old could muster. His phone buzzed with a text. "Rachel. Merry Christmas. Are you still okay with me coming over this afternoon?" He smiled, typed back, "More than okay. Emma's been asking about the butterfly lady all week." Rachel's response came quickly. "The butterfly lady is nervous but excited. See you at 3. When she arrived, she brought cookies she'd clearly made herself, slightly lopsided but decorated with careful precision. Emma opened the door and immediately pulled her inside to show her every single present she'd received, narrating their features with breathless enthusiasm. Mark watched from the kitchen doorway as Rachel sat cross-legged on the living room floor, admiring a new doll and asking questions that made Emma light up. And he thought about the text message that had started all of this. The accident that wasn't really an accident. The mistake that had given them both permission to stop hiding. Sometimes the best things in life come from the messages we never meant to send. Sometimes mistakes are just fate wearing a disguise, pushing us toward the connections we need most. Sometimes love shows up at 2 in the morning, in the rain, asking questions we're terrified to answer, offering second chances we didn't think we deserved. Mark had spent 2 years believing his story was over, that the best parts of his life were behind him. But watching Rachel and Emma together, seeing the way his daughter laughed and the way Rachel's eyes softened when she looked at both of them, he realized something. Stories don't end, they just change shape. They transform into something new, something unexpected, something that feels like hope. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything.